Yvonne. Uh, good morning from New York. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person, but was really honoured to be asked to speak a little bit this morning. I hope you'll excuse my strong Australian accent. I've been in the States about 8 years, but still have that going strong. I'm seeing a bunch of, as you might know, of course, from many years of Zooms now, lots of black boxes and things like that on my screen. So feel free to chime in with questions in the chat as we go, or if anything technical goes funny. Let me see about sharing the PowerPoint that I have. Okay, give me a second.
By the way, I'm fake Yvonne.
Oh, you're fake Yvonne. Okay, go.
Yeah, because
even better. Got you.
Baby, and I'm Hilal, but no problem. Just
terrific. Okay, well, in general, that's right. I think it's become a bit of a movable feast on these conferences, hasn't it? Well, thank you all. As I say, I was asked to talk, I suppose, with you all today a little bit about the work we've been doing at Columbia, specifically at the new climate school, and even more specifically in one of the Earth networks, which are effectively pilot community building initiatives that are designed to find ways to connect folks across disciplines and across the university here in New York. Ours is called the Climate Imaginations Network, and our focus in broad terms is climate, creativity, and community. So I'll aim to speak a little bit about what prompted the context, the intellectual and spiritual, if you will, context for some of the ideas we've developed, and our ways of proceeding, some of the challenges we've encountered and ways we've tried to address those challenges, and some of the things that we've learned. And so I understand, of course, that there's a whole range of really interesting talks you've been happy to listen to today. I hope this one contributes something or is a different angle on some of the practical and intellectual themes that you're exploring. The starting point, and also I'll do my best. I'm a former lawyer, and so I have a tendency to ramble. I'll do my best to keep an eye on the time here as well. But again, please feel free to flag if I'm diving off. The first thing, the first idea I think that motivates our work, and that I'd love to hear from folks in the Q&A if it resonates, is as you know, in the context of all of the kind of policy, engineering, practical, and other forms of scientific thinking around climate change, adaptation, mitigation, things like that, has loomed for us this question about imagination, and specifically this idea that in some way, even though it's hard to articulate, as David Wallace Wells said in The Uninhabitable Earth, that our responses in some sense reveal a failure of our collective imagination. That there's something about, and that it follows from that, I should say, that there's something about imagination that is really key for us to connect with or reconnect with or explore in amongst and at the same time as we're facilitating all of these other changes. Specifically for us at CCIN, it's been interesting to think through that question of imagination in terms of the theme of storytelling, and particularly stories about the future. For us, and this is by no means an idea that's original to us, I should mention, there are lots of folks working on this, but one of our starting points is this idea that the stories we tend to hear and tell each other about the future under climate change are very often black and white. So that is to say that they're either apocalypses, you know, oh no, we're expletive, or utopias, right? Don't worry because we're about to get solar panels on Mars, or someone's about to figure out a way to stick gigantic sails above the earth and save everything, or what have you. Elon Musk style techno-utopianism in the jargon. What's the problem with those kinds of stories? Because they can be incredibly seductive and compelling, of course, and make great movies, particularly the dystopias. But from our perspective, what's been really interesting is the fact that practically and politically speaking, my other hat, I should say at this point, at Columbia is in the political theory program, working on environmental politics and environmental philosophy. So if we think sort of practically or functionally about not so much about the content of the stories, but about their outcome, we start to see that although they seem different in content, in practice, both utopias and apocalypses tend to lead to the same kind of outcome. And that outcome is, spoiler alert, inaction, right? For different reasons, but in the first case, because we're, as I've got on the slide here, too depressed to do anything. It's incredibly disempowering and demoralizing. And in the second case, because we think, quote unquote, someone else, some unspecified somebody usually, has everything in hand. Again, maybe it's Elon Musk, maybe it's a mysterious scientist who we love, but somebody has this under control. And as such, we don't have to ourselves try to find new forms of agency that might let us engage. So like I've got up here, in both cases, it seemed to us that those kinds of stories lead to inaction, which leads in a variety of ways, and without getting too conspiratorial about it, to this idea that the status quo is maintained. It's also worth noting, and I know some others may also know, that Grace Nosek, who's a really wonderful thinker and one of the co-founders of the Sustainability Hub at the University of British Columbia, she was slated, I think, to speak originally today, but had the PhD students in the room will know this, some conflicts with defences. But I would highly encourage folks to check out some of her work. She's looked in detail at the way that both of those kinds of narratives have in fact been really embraced by the fossil fuel industry over the last, as an alternative or as an evolution of denial stories over the last however many years. So that, for us, as I say, at CCIN, led to two challenges. To explain the first one, call it a substantive challenge, we started to wonder, well, look, what does it look like to imagine futures, as it were, in the middle? Stories that are middle ground futures, that aren't taking the easy road of apocalypses or utopias, that are trying to grapple sincerely with it turns out, far more difficult question, both in obviously a real world sense, but also in an imaginative sense, of telling realistic, tangible, but also empowering and remoralizing, as it were, climate stories. One of the interesting themes for us in the conversations we've had in various domains has been this thought that, and this, again, I think is a really powerful lesson of the humanities from my perspective in this work, is that this state that we're in, of course, isn't necessary, as it were, which is to say, it's historically specific, and it's the result of a whole lot of decisions and policies and cultural shifts that have happened. More specifically, from our perspective, it's a result of this idea that if you will, our imaginative vocabularies have atrophied, and that we've lost a bunch of vocabularies for a whole lot of reasons. And so a threshold step, you might say, for us to be able to tell the kinds of stories we hope to see and bring into being is to rebuild those vocabularies. And part of the work we've done in a range of different venues, gatherings and workshops and roundtables and things, is to explore some of the ways that has happened. What for us was then interesting, and may touch on some of the themes that folks are exploring there in person today, is a secondary problem that, or challenge, if you will, that arose when we started to think about that first challenge in practice. And the second challenge was very much a kind of practical, social, cultural one. Namely, and I imagine this has been a theme today as well, all of these problems are too big for us to solve on our own. And that requires, and when I say on our own, I mean in all of the different dimensions of our lives. Our ethnicity, our religious backgrounds, our genders, our cultural experiences, all those sorts of things, our professions. In the academic world, of course, it means different disciplines, but it certainly extends far beyond that as well. And from a purely social perspective, those conversations, as I imagine folks there know, are really hard. It's really hard to find ways to have conversations across disciplines. And it's hard for, obviously, the reasons that a lot of us are familiar with, that we speak different theoretical and technical languages, that we have different understandings of what scholarship is and what questions and problems are and so on and so forth, different methods. But it's also hard from my perspective, for a much simpler reason, which is that, and a social reason, that those kind of vulnerable conversations, or those conversations require vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. And trust, of course, is something particularly in fraught or complex situations that isn't, and against the backdrop of different historical oppressions and forms of domination, isn't something we can take for granted. And so that in really tangible terms led us to ask this question at our university, well, where can we even have these conversations? We want to have conversations about, as I said, rebuilding emotional vocabularies or imaginative vocabularies. But as we looked around, it seemed to us that there were, like I've got on the slide, I like spectra, as you're probably starting to learn. There are lots of spaces on two ends of a different spectrum. First, lots of professional spaces, and I think this is probably true across a wide variety of campuses: conferences, roundtables, paper presentations, works in progress, seminars, things like that. Places for us to share our ideas in a more or less polished form. And then on the other end, plenty of purely social spaces, of course, hit in a pretty serious way since COVID, but nonetheless, right? Drinks, evenings, catch up, cafes, salons, what have you. But again, and this was becoming a recurring theme for us by this point, not much in the middle. Not many places that were formal enough for folks to feel like they could dive deeply into the ideas and philosophy and personal questions that came to mind for them, but at the same time, welcoming, inclusive, friendly, and informal enough for folks to feel safe, in simple terms, to have those kinds of conversations. So those were the two challenges that have framed our work so far. As I mentioned at the outset, our network is one of about a dozen, I think, at this stage, that are all all prototypes. Imaginative prototypes is one term that folks have used. And as such, we've had a great deal of latitude. I feel really fortunate that we've had a lot of latitude to explore to experiment, to try different things, to respond to folks' suggestions in the community about what kinds of things would be helpful to them, and to create little spaces, if you will, that we can test some of these ideas out. So specifically, like I've got on the slide, I would say that the main idea for us has been trying to, again, this is somewhat jargony, I suppose, but to create a third space to bring folks together around the kinds of things that I think, not coincidentally, we might remember from places as far back as elementary school. Again, good old-fashioned, time-tested things that help folks get together. Food is obviously classic, although that brings its own challenges. But also for us, hands-on art making, be it clay, be it zine making, be it some other form of creative engagement. And also creative ways of having conversations, reading groups or Q&As or different things like that. Again, with a focus, and explicitly for us, on building community and trust and the kinds of other social links that will help us explore the stories that I talked about a minute ago. I'll talk briefly now, I suppose, about just in somewhat of a more nitty-gritty way, some of the different concrete experiments we've run, so to speak. Makes it sound a bit like lab rats, but things we've tried, and some of the challenges that we've faced and the learnings. And I hope that might be useful for any and all of you all who are grappling with similar things or working on similar communities in your own contexts. I've got up on the screen rather here just a couple of the different things we've tried. We've had some success with again, salon, I think, is a bit of a pretentious term, but gathering series once a fortnight for the last academic year, circulating around, as I said, a particular kind of embodied artistic activity, a walk or as I said, zines, music, food making, storytelling online, different activities like that. We've had some success as well with what I would call a micro grants initiative. So effectively working to allocate small amounts, little micro chunks of our budget to, facilitate proposals by people from all around the Columbia community for activities that they see might be of benefit to their communities or in the worlds that they move in. And so some examples of those have been some folks who've organised a forest expedition, or in the process of organising that. We've had a film screening organised by some students in a sustainability program. We've had a paper making workshop. We have another person talking about doing some participatory art. We've also done some storytelling workshops, including in collaboration with a set of really intriguing organisations folks may be familiar with. Rewrite the Future is one at the organisation, the Natural Resources Defence Council, based out of California, here in the States. Another one being a group called the Good Energy Project, which is based also in California, and I'd encourage people to check out. And we've been exploring beyond that some physical collaborations and presentations. So there, as you might imagine, there's a huge number of different really interesting and often really specific, which is to say locally rooted community organizations and arts organizations in particular in New York City. One that we've been glad to collaborate with in particular is out in Brooklyn, in a historically industrial area of Brooklyn, called Second Sundays. Oh, sorry, called Pioneer Works, rather, is the organization. Second Sundays is their initiative. Some of the challenges I think that we've faced, and again, I'd be really interested to hear from folks in the Q&A in a few minutes about others that come to mind in similar work that others have done. I've popped a few up here on the screen. One of them, again, a somewhat technical term, but call it legibility. What I mean by that is simply trying to articulate this challenge, which, as you know, as you might have gotten a sense, is a little bit squishy, if you will, is sort of strategically ambiguous or a little nebulous. When we're talking about this idea of stories and the future and connecting the social and professional and cultural lives that we all have and the communities we hope to build, how do we explain that in a simple way that doesn't, I mean, a bit like I mentioned at the start, right? That's interesting and capacious enough for folks to be able to plug in as they would like to, but not so vague that folks think, oh, I'm really not sure what to do here at all. A second challenge or problem that I think is really worth dwelling on and has been productive for us to dwell on is this question of elitism and privilege. That's, I think, particularly pointed at a university like Columbia, which of course is exceptionally well-resourced and occupies a very specific kind of position culturally in the academic world. But I think has been a question that we've encountered more generally as we've grappled with this sort of theme that I think comes up for a lot of creative and artistic folks, which is effectively, you know, is it already, or what are the ways in which, how do we deal with the ways in which it's already a privilege or affluent, if you will, to have the luxury of engaging artistically and creatively with some of these enormous questions? That, of course, is not something that folks who are on the front lines or in the hardest impacted communities have the capacity or the interest in doing, because their primary goal, and completely justifiably, is to work through the very concrete material questions about protecting themselves and their ecosystem of families and communities. And so challenging ourselves to work through what does that look like to deal with or bring questions about creativity and artistic practice, creativity in the broader sense, not just artistic making, bring those things in a way that is mindful of and critically aware of those other contexts. Balancing process and product has been a third challenge for us, which I think can be framed similarly. How do we offer enough outcomes or work towards outcomes in a way that gives our community enough direction, while at the same time creating enough space for folks to feel like there's a space where not everything has to be instrumental and not everything has to be directed towards specific tangible products in a physical sense. The fourth one, and this I think is particularly interesting in universities where so many of us are, in my experience, socialized to avoid failure at all costs, has been that in our experience, failure, or I tend to call them kind of clunks, right? Those moments where you're having a conversation with someone across disciplines and things clunk, right? It's not so much that there's a clear moment where somebody says, I don't understand this. It's just a blank look, or somebody leaves the meeting, or what have you. Dealing with that. I know I've just got a couple of minutes left, so I'll treat these next ones briefly. Compensating people adequately, which I think is self-explanatory. And then a few words on the final challenge I've listed, avoiding cooptation, which is just to say, I think there's a tendency, again, for maybe cooptation is too strong a word in some contexts, but broadly speaking, avoiding situations where storytelling and imagination, so to speak, magnetizes or is sucked immediately into science communication. Although, of course, that's incredibly important, but our hope is to keep that at least somewhat distinct. Or in the context of present day culture, to have situations where storytelling just gets sucked into the service of selling things. Those are two things we've been keen to avoid. I won't go through these lessons in great detail because I believe this is my last slide. Yes, it is, so I can leave these up for folks to mull on. But some of them, as I've got here, have been in line with what I've said through the talk: relationship and trust building, this question of what are often called silos, a balkanized university context, the challenge of helping folks understand that when we talk about imagination, even in an academic context, we mean the common sense understanding of that, the thing that we all do in our creative work and our everyday lives as we engage with the world and each other. And also to try and avoid, as best we can, hierarchies, jargon, and things like that. And finally, to create space, which I think artistic and creative work can help us do well in lots of contexts, for holding the emotions of all of this sort of stuff. Again, the difficult stuff, the difficult feelings, the pauses, the discomfort, the things that are easy to sweep under the rug, but that we have to, in my experience, try our best to find ways to hold with each other and help each other with as we do this as we sustain ourselves in this work. So I will leave it there. I think I've hit, 10, 20 minutes past on the head. Thank you all so much for listening and sharing this with me even virtually. And I'll throw it back all to you in case there's some facilitation you'd like to do, I suppose, for the next few minutes.
And thanks for the presentation, Ben. Now we are stopping the recording.